My name is Elena Voss, 34 years old, actuary. And 3 days after I gave birth to my triplets, my mother-in-law placed a $25 million check on my hospital blanket and told me to choose. The room still carried that sharp, cold smell of antiseptic and fresh linen. My body ached in ways I didn't know it could, but my arms were full. 3 tiny babies, 2 girls and 1 boy, warm and breathing against me. Behind Vivian stood my husband Marcus, and the woman he'd been seeing for months. She held a designer diaper bag like she was already moving in. Vivian, elegant as always in her cream silk blouse, uncapped her heavy black fountain pen. The click echoed louder than any monitor in that room. "$25 million, Elena," she said calmly, sliding the check closer. "Sign the papers, hand over the children, and disappear. You were never really one of us anyway." I looked at the stack of documents. Divorce papers, custody relinquishment, a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to choke on. Then I looked at my babies. Little Rowan, already fussing. Sophie, quiet and watchful. And baby Theo, the smallest, gripping my finger like he already knew the world was complicated. I picked up the pen. I signed. Not because I was giving up, but because I understood something Vivian never would. Sometimes the smartest move is to let them think they've won. I handed the papers back with steady hands. Then I did the one thing none of them expected. I gathered my 3 newborns, stood up on legs that still trembled, and walked out of that room. By the time their lawyers woke up, the next morning, the most expensive signature Vivian Harrington had ever bought was already worthless. And the woman they dismissed as just a calculator had already started taking apart everything they held dear. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, stay with me. This is the story of how I took their money, kept my children, and quietly balanced their entire empire to zero. If that resonates with you, drop a heart right now and type "I'm listening" in the comments. Let's begin. Here's what I do for a living. I price the things people prefer not to think about. How long a life lasts, how much care costs when the body starts to fail, what a promise signed decades ago is actually worth when it comes due. I'm an actuary. For 12 years, I've sat in quiet rooms, running the numbers that insurance companies bet their entire future on. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for pretty Instagram photos. But it's honest work, and it taught me something my father drilled into me from the time I was a girl. "The numbers don't lie, Elena," he used to say while sorting insurance forms at our kitchen table. "People do. Learn the difference." He sold life insurance out of a small storefront in a tired Midwest town. When he passed suddenly when I was 27, those words became my compass. I learned to stay calm when columns refused to balance. I learned that panic is just bad math in a hurry. While my coworkers raised their voices in meetings, I stayed quiet. "I don't get loud," I used to tell them with a small smile. "I get accurate." The Harrington family found that endlessly amusing. To them, I was the plain, numbers-obsessed girl their son Marcus brought home from an industry conference. A temporary phase he would eventually outgrow. They never once asked what I was actually good at. That was their first mistake. Even before I married into that world, something about Harrington Life and Legacy never sat right with me. Their public filings glowed a little too brightly. Their loss ratios looked a little too perfect. I told myself it wasn't my company. I told myself to stay in my lane. I was wrong about which part of that sentence would eventually matter most. I met Marcus at a national insurance conference in Chicago. He was charming in that effortless, expensive way. The kind of charm that costs nothing and means even less. He told me his family had built one of the largest long-term care and life insurance companies in the Northeast. What he didn't mention was that his mother, Vivian, had been running the show with an iron fist since his father died. We married 18 months later. I kept my job and my maiden name on all my professional licenses, more out of habit than any grand foresight. For a while, I tried to fit in. I smiled politely at their estate dinners, learned which fork to use, and stayed quiet while they talked about bloodlines and legacy, like the rest of the world was simply background noise. But I always felt it, that invisible line between wanted and useful. They wanted Marcus to marry someone with the right last name and social connections. Instead, he brought home a woman who could read a balance sheet better than most of their executives. Useful, perhaps. Never wanted. For years, I told myself the coldness was just old money being old money. I was the outsider who would slowly earn her place. I was good with numbers, after all. I had sold myself worse equations than that. Then I got pregnant. Triplets. And suddenly, Vivian started looking at my belly the way other people look at winnings lottery tickets. She would rest her hand there without asking, call them the future of the Harrington name, smile at me in a way that didn't reach her eyes. That was the first time I felt truly afraid, because I finally understood what this family valued most. Control. And they had decided my children were the key to keeping it for another generation. If you've ever felt like you were only tolerated in your own family, type, "I see you," in the comments. You're not alone in this story. The first 2 years of our marriage felt like a carefully staged performance. I played the role of the supportive wife who had married up, and Marcus played the devoted husband in public. Behind closed doors, the cracks were already forming. He started working later and later. Phone calls taken in the garden with a softer tone he never used with me. Small transfers leaving our joint account to destinations I didn't recognize. When I asked him about one particular wire of nearly $200,000, he looked at his plate and said it was a company thing. I don't believe plates, so I did what I do best. I started hedging. Quietly, I opened accounts in my own name. I moved a financial cushion over. Nothing dramatic, just enough to breathe if things went south. I made copies of every important document. Mortgages, investment statements, insurance policies, even old emails. I kept them in a safe place only I could access. I packed a go bag and stored it near the door, telling myself it was just being responsible. I even started reviewing Harrington Life and Legacy's public filings again at night, telling myself it was harmless professional curiosity. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Reading risk is my entire profession. I could feel a storm coming long before the first raindrop fell. You don't hedge because you're certain disaster is coming. You hedge because you can't afford to be wrong if it does. The pregnancy with triplets changed everything. My body was exhausted, but my mind had never been sharper. Vivian's mask started slipping. She went from barely tolerating me to suddenly obsessed with my belly. She talked about securing the bloodline and how these children would store the family's strength. Marcus, meanwhile, grew more distant. The softness I once mistook for warmth had completely vanished. Some nights he didn't come home at all. The perfume on his collar wasn't mine. The lipstick on his shirt wasn't my shade. A man's silence can be data too. So I prepared even more seriously. I found a trusted mentor. Ruth, a retired senior actuary who once worked in the state insurance department. She was the only person I told about my growing suspicions. She listened without judgment and simply said, "Document everything, Elena. Numbers are your armor." I leased a small furnished apartment 2 towns away under my maiden name. I installed a car seat base in my car. I updated my will and made sure custody preferences were clearly documented with my lawyer. All of it done in silence. Because here's what I've learned in my 34 years. The people who scream the loudest are rarely the most dangerous. The truly dangerous ones move quietly, plan carefully, and strike only when they're certain they can't lose. I refuse to be the woman who waited until the knife was at her throat. If you've ever started preparing for the worst while still hoping for the best, you understand exactly where I was in those months. It's a lonely place. But it's also a powerful one. By the time my water broke on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I had already built myself an exit ramp. I just didn't know how soon I would need to take it. The triplets came into the world fighting. 3 perfect, furious little lives. I named them right there in the delivery room before anyone could object. Sophie, Rowan, and Theo. My last name on their birth certificates. A small, quiet declaration that they belonged to me first. Marcus arrived late, smelling faintly of another woman's perfume. He held them like they were borrowed. Vivian wasn't there yet, but I could already feel her coming. For 3 short days, it was just me and my babies in that quiet hospital room. 3 warm little bodies. 3 reasons to be brave. Then the lavender scent arrived. And everything changed. The lavender arrived on day 3. Vivian swept into the room first, followed by Marcus, then a woman I'd never seen before, carrying a luxury diaper bag, and finally their family attorney in a crisp gray suit. The air in the room thickened instantly. "Alina," Vivian said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "This is Sloane. She and Marcus have been close for some time now." Sloane gave me a small, pitying smile. Marcus stared at the floor like a child caught stealing cookies. The attorney, Garrett, laid a thick folder on my tray table and opened it with practiced efficiency. Divorce papers, a generous settlement, and underneath it all, a full relinquishment of parental rights. Vivian sat on the edge of my bed without asking permission. She uncapped that heavy black fountain pen again. The click cut through the beeping monitors like a gunshot. $25 million, she said calmly. All you have to do is sign, hand over the children, and disappear from our lives. You'll be rich. Free. And the triplets will grow up as proper Harrington heirs, with the guidance they deserve. She leaned in slightly, her signature perfume wrapping around me like a threat. You were never family, dear. You were a means to an end. A vessel. Sign and everyone wins. I looked at my 3 babies. Sophie was sleeping peacefully against my chest. Rowan was starting to stir. Theo gripped my hospital gown with his tiny fist. In that moment, my mind did what it always does under pressure. It ran the numbers. First, a document signed under duress in a hospital bed with your husband's mistress present would never hold up in court. Second, you cannot legally buy children. Custody is decided by the best interest of the child, not a checkbook. Third, and most important, I was their mother. So I did the only logical thing. I took the pen. I signed every page with my married name. Slowly, carefully, making sure they saw me do it. I even added a small, tired smile at the end so they would relax. Then I capped the pen, handed the folder back, and said quietly, "We're done here." I reached for my babies, one by one, and placed them gently into the hospital bassinet beside me. The nurse, who had been watching silently from the doorway, gave me a small nod of support. There was no screaming, no dramatic exit. I simply waited until visiting hours ended and the floor grew quiet. Ruth was already waiting in the parking garage. Another quiet preparation I had made weeks earlier. I buckled my 3 newborns into the car seats I had secretly installed, and we drove away into the night. Not running. Repositioning. Because the calm isn't weakness. It's strategy. On that quiet drive, while my babies slept under the passing streetlights, I made myself a silent promise. I would never again let anyone treat my children like bargaining chips. and I would make sure the people who tried would never have the power to do it again. If you've ever had to protect your peace while everyone around you thought you were broken, you know how heavy and how freeing that moment feels. I wasn't escaping. I was preparing the battlefield. Those first 3 days in the hospital before Vivian arrived were some of the most precious and clarifying moments of my life. The triplets had come the old-fashioned way, no scheduled C-section, just pure determination and a long, intense labor. Sophie arrived first, then Rowan 2 minutes later, and little Theo 8 minutes after that. All 3 of them cried with strong, healthy lungs. All 3 of them had my eyes. I named them right there in the delivery room while Marcus was still stuck in traffic. Sophie Rose, Rowan James, and Theodore Michael Voss. My last name. My choice. A small but powerful line in the sand. During those quiet hospital days, it was just me and my babies. I memorized every little detail. The way Sophie made soft cooing sounds when she was content, how Rowan would fuss until he was swaddled just right, and how Theo would stare at me with those serious newborn eyes like he already understood more than he should. I hummed off-key lullabies at 3 a.m. I traced their tiny fingers and whispered promises I intended to keep. For the first time in years, I felt completely anchored. These 3 little souls weren't bargaining chips or legacy extensions. They were mine to protect, to raise, and to love without conditions. Ruth visited every day. She brought me real food, sat with the babies while I showered, and reminded me I wasn't alone. She was the only person who knew the full extent of my preparations. When the nurse asked about the birth certificates, Ruth stood beside me as I gave my maiden name. No hesitation. I knew the storm was coming. I could feel Vivian's approach the same way I could feel a bad actuarial assumption from across a conference table. But for those brief days, I let myself simply be a mother. I thought about my own parents. How my father taught me that numbers tell the truth when people won't. How my mother taught me quiet strength. I realized I had been preparing for this moment long before I even met Marcus. The morning of day 3, as the antiseptic smell still lingered and my body still felt like it had been through war, I made one final quiet preparation. I drafted a revocation letter in my head. Formal notice that any documents signed under duress were immediately withdrawn. I would mail it registered the moment I was safely away. Because here's what they never understood about me. I don't panic. I calculate. And every calculation told me the same thing. If I played their game their way, I would lose. So I changed the game entirely. When the lavender finally entered the room that afternoon, I was ready. Not emotionally. No one is ever truly ready for that kind of betrayal. But strategically, I had my exit plan. I had my children, and most importantly, I still had my mind. The woman they called just a calculator was about to show them exactly what she was capable of. If you've ever had a moment where everything clicked and you knew you had to protect your family no matter the cost, type "protect" in the comments. I see you. I was right there with you. The click of that fountain pen was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Vivian sat too close on the edge of my bed, her lavender perfume wrapping around me like chains. Garrett the attorney cleared his throat and began explaining the documents, in careful, legal language designed to intimidate. Sloane stood behind Marcus like she already belonged there. $25 million is more than generous, Vivian said, tapping the check with one perfectly manicured nail. You sign, you walk away wealthy, and the children receive the upbringing they deserve. Private schools, proper social circles, the Harrington name. Everyone wins. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they hold all the cards. You were never cut out for this life, Elena. Be honest with yourself. You're a numbers person. Practical. These children need legacy. They need guidance. They need us. I let her talk. While she spoke, my mind quietly ran through the 3 truths I had already calculated. 1. A hospital bed relinquishment signed under clear duress with the husband's mistress present would be thrown out by any competent judge. 2. No amount of money can legally purchase parental rights. Courts care about the best interest of the children, not bank accounts. 3. I was their mother. No piece of paper could change biology or the love I already felt. So I signed. I took my time making sure each signature was clear and legible. I even asked Garrett to explain one clause just to buy a few more seconds of calm. When I finished, I handed the folder back and looked Vivian directly in the eyes. "Thank you for the offer," I said softly. "We're done here." I reached for my babies. One by one, I lifted them. Sophie first, then Rowan, then Theo, and held all 3 close. My arms were exhausted, my body still recovering, but my grip was firm. Vivian's smile faltered for the first time. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, voice sharpening. "I'm going home with my children," I replied calmly. "The papers are signed. You got what you wanted. Now leave." Marcus finally spoke, his voice weak. "Elena, don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. "You made your choice months ago," I said. "I'm making mine now." Security was called, but by then I had already been discharged. Ruth was waiting downstairs with a car. I walked out of that hospital on shaky legs, pushing the bassinet myself, 3 car seats waiting in the back of Ruth's SUV. There was no dramatic chase. No shouting match in the hallway. Just a quiet, determined mother carrying her babies into a new chapter. Later that night, safe in the furnished apartment I had secretly prepared, I sat on the floor with my 3 sleeping babies on a blanket and allowed myself one single moment of grief. Then I made a list. Because grief is allowed. But it doesn't get to drive. $25 million had bought Vivian nothing but my full, undivided attention. And I was about to use every skill I possessed to make sure she would never threaten my family again. If you've ever had to walk away from toxicity while carrying everything that mattered to you, you know how heavy and how liberating that walk feels. This was only the beginning. The drive to the apartment was quiet except for the soft breathing of my 3 newborns in the back seat. Ruth kept glancing at me, worry and pride mixed in her expression. "You sure you're okay?" she asked gently. I nodded, watching the streetlights pass. My body hurt, my heart hurt, but my mind had never been clearer. "I'm not running, Ruth. I'm repositioning." We arrived at the small, furnished apartment I had leased, under my maiden name, 2 months earlier. The go bag I packed was already waiting by the door. Clothes for the babies, important documents, formula, diapers, and a laptop. Everything I would need for the first few weeks. I settled the triplets into the portable cribs I had secretly delivered days before. Then I sat on the floor beside them and finally let the tears come. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet, exhausted tears for the marriage I thought I had, for the family I never really belonged to, and for the version of myself that once believed love could be earned through quiet compliance. After 10 minutes, I wiped my face, made a bottle, and got to work. First, I sent the pre-drafted revocation letter through registered mail and email to their attorney. It clearly stated that any documents signed that day were under extreme duress and were immediately withdrawn. I kept every receipt. Then I opened my laptop and started a new folder titled simply Harrington. Inside it, I began organizing everything I had collected over the past year. Financial records, suspicious transfers, public filings, internal memos. Marcus had carelessly left in our home office. The picture wasn't pretty. Harrington Life and Legacy had been playing dangerous games with their reserve requirements for long-term care policies. On paper, they looked bulletproof. In reality, they were promising care they didn't have the money to deliver. Thousands of elderly policyholders were counting on a promise that was quietly hollow. Vivian hadn't just tried to buy my children. She had gambled other people's futures to maintain her illusion of control. By 4 a.m., with all 3 babies fed and sleeping, I allowed myself one small, calm smile. They thought they had removed a problem. Instead, they had handed a highly skilled actuary $25 million, full custody of her motivation, and complete freedom to examine their empire without interference. The next morning, Vivian called at exactly 9:17. I let it ring twice before answering. "Alina," she said, her voice missing its usual ice, "let's be reasonable." I kept my tone even, almost gentle. "I am being reasonable, Vivian. I'm keeping my children and your money. That seems very reasonable to me." She started with threats. I hung up. Then I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began the real work. Because the calm isn't surrender. It's a countdown. By noon the next day, the panic on their side was already showing. Marcus called first. His voice cracked when I answered. "Alina, what the hell are you doing? Mom is losing her mind. The lawyers say the relinquishment papers might not be as solid as they thought." I was feeding Theo while Sophie and Rowan napped. I kept my voice low and steady. "I'm doing what any mother would do. I'm protecting my children." He tried every version of himself I had ever known. The charming husband, the remorseful man, the desperate negotiator. None of them worked. Because I finally saw him clearly. When none of that moved me, he dropped the mask. "You need to stop whatever you're planning," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." That was the moment I knew I was right about everything. He wasn't afraid of losing the children. He was afraid of what I might find if I started looking too closely at the company. Vivian called again that evening. This time, she tried a different approach. She spoke about her late husband. How he built the company from nothing. How the family legacy was all she had left. How the triplets represented hope for the future. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, an old woman terrified of watching her empire crumble. Then she reminded me who she really was. "Those children are Harrington's, Elena. They belong with their name. You are always temporary. Sign the new papers, and we can make this go away quietly." I let the silence stretch for a few seconds. "No," I said simply, "I won't." She hung up on me. That night, while the triplets slept, I opened the full set of public filings and internal documents I had copied. The more I read, the clearer it became. Harrington Life and Legacy had been under-reserving for years. They were using aggressive assumptions about lapse rates and mortality that didn't match reality. The gap was massive, hundreds of millions. They had been selling promises they couldn't keep. And my children were supposed to be the next generation to inherit that lie. I closed the laptop and looked at my sleeping babies. In that moment, my purpose crystallized. This was no longer just about custody or revenge. It was about protecting more than just my family. It was about protecting the thousands of elderly clients who trusted the Harrington name. The quiet woman they tried to buy off had just become their biggest problem. If you've ever reached a point where protecting others gave you strength, type stronger in the comments. That's exactly how I felt that night. The countdown had officially begun. The next few weeks looked like any new mother's life from the outside. Feedings, sleepless nights, diaper changes, and quiet moments staring at my 3 miracles. But while the world saw a tired single mom, I was doing the deepest work of my career. Every night, after the babies went down, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and spreadsheets. I rebuilt Harrington Life and Legacy's reserve position from publicly available data, cross-referencing it with industry tables and my own models. What I found was worse than I expected. They had been systematically under-reserving for long-term care policies for nearly a decade. The assumptions they filed with regulators were optimistic to the point of fraud. Lapse rates that no real population had ever produced. Mortality projections that ignored the reality of people living longer with expensive care needs. On paper, the company looked rock solid. In truth, it was a beautiful house built on sand. One internal memo I had copied from Marcus's home office proved it beyond doubt. It showed two different sets of numbers. One for regulators, one for internal use. The gap was enormous. Marcus had initialed it. I wasn't angry anymore, I was focused. I reached out to Ruth again. We met in her kitchen while my babies played in a playpen. She reviewed my analysis for hours, her experienced eyes moving across every page. "You've built this clean," she finally said. "But you need to do the next part exactly right." She taught me the regulatory pathway. An actuary with credible concerns could file a formal complaint with the state insurance department. If the concern held water, they could open a full financial examination. That examination could lead to supervision, rehabilitation, or even liquidation if necessary. Ruth didn't write a single line of my report. She didn't need to. The work was already mine. What she gave me was something far more valuable. A clear map of the load-bearing wall. "If you're right," she said, tapping my shortfall calculation, "you won't have to destroy them. The truth will do it for you." I looked at the final number I had rebuilt. Clean, defensible, and devastating. It matched the internal document perfectly. That night, while feeding Theo at 2 a.m., I made my decision. I wasn't going to expose an affair. I wasn't going to drag them through a messy custody battle they could drag out for years. I was going to expose the lie at the heart of their empire. Because behind those thin reserves were real people. Retired teachers, factory workers, and widows who had paid premiums for decades, trusting that the care would be there when they needed it most. Vivian had gambled their futures to keep her illusion of power alive. I couldn't let that stand. My revenge had grown up. It was no longer personal. It had become principled. If you've ever realized that standing up wasn't just for you, but for everyone the powerful tried to ignore, you understand exactly where I was in that moment. The quiet calculator had found the crack in the foundation, and she was about to push. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of dance between motherhood and quiet warfare. During the day, I was completely present for Sophie, Rowan, and Theo, singing lullabies, doing tummy time, learning their individual personalities. Sophie was the observer. Rowan was the loud one. Theo was the snuggler. At night, after they were asleep, I became the actuary again. I licensed additional industry data. I ran multiple scenarios with increasingly conservative assumptions. I documented every step so thoroughly that even a hospital expert would have trouble finding fault. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about building something bulletproof. Marcus showed up at the apartment one evening unannounced. He looked exhausted, older than his 36 years. "I miss you," he said at first. "I miss them. I made terrible mistakes." I let him speak. When that didn't work, he switched to negotiation, offering more money, offering shared custody, offering anything to make me stop. When none of that moved me, the real Marcus appeared. "You need to stop digging, Elena," he said, voice low and ugly. "For your own good." He never once mentioned fighting for the children. Not once. That told me everything I needed to know. "I'm not digging," I replied calmly. I'm finishing what your family started." He left looking terrified. Vivian came next. She chose a quiet coffee shop in a neighboring town and arrived alone. For a few minutes, she seemed almost human. She spoke about her late husband, how he built the company, how she couldn't bear to let his legacy die. For one brief moment, I felt the pull of sympathy. Then she reminded me who she was. "Those children belong with their bloodline," she said, the softness disappearing. "You were always just a temporary solution. Sign the new agreement and we can all move on." I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. "I won't let you gamble other people's lives to protect your pride." She left angry. I left more determined. I spent the next days polishing my report until it shone like glass. Every assumption tested, every source cited, every step reproducible. When it was finished, I had a document that any regulator in the country could pick up and follow. I filed the formal complaint with the state insurance department through both mail and their official portal. I attached my credentials. I kept every receipt. No press, no drama. Just the truth, delivered professionally. Then I waited. The machine that exists to protect policyholders had received a credible warning from someone who knew exactly how to read the numbers. And it began to move. If you've ever chosen the harder, quieter path because it was the right one, you know the kind of peace that comes with that decision. I had pushed the first domino. Now I just had to watch the rest fall. After filing the complaint, I didn't celebrate. I simply sat in my car outside the post office and let my hands stop shaking for the first time in weeks. It was done. The truth was now in the hands of people whose job was to act on it. I had done everything I could do cleanly and honestly. The rest was no longer mine to control. The state insurance department moved faster than even Ruth expected. Within weeks, I heard through industry channels that a formal financial examinations had been opened on Harrington Life and Legacy. Examiners were requesting internal working papers, reserve calculations, and cash flow models. I knew what they would find. Marcus called me one last time, sounding broken. "They're tearing the company apart," he whispered. "Mom won't speak to me. The board is panicking." "What did you do?" "I told the truth," I said simply. "Something none of you have done in years." Sloan was the first to abandon ship. She had bet on the Harrington name and the money behind it. When that name started to crack, she disappeared overnight, leaving Marcus with nothing but regret and legal bills. Vivian tried one final time. She sent a message through a mutual acquaintance asking me to meet to resolve this like civilized people. I declined. There was nothing left to resolve. The process I had started was bigger than both of us now. Meanwhile, my life with the triplets grew into a beautiful rhythm. I watched them hit milestones. First smiles. First coups. First time they reached for each other. I took them on walks in the park and whispered stories about strength and integrity. I was determined they would never grow up believing money made a person untouchable. The custody case, when it finally reached a real courtroom, was almost an afterthought. The judge took one look at the hospital bed. Relinquishment, signed under duress, with the husband's mistress present, and dismissed it immediately. My financial stability, clean record, and the fact that their father was now under professional investigation made the decision straightforward. The triplets stayed with me permanently. The $25 million remained mine as well. It had come from the family's personal trust, not the company, so it was untouched by the unfolding regulatory storm. I used part of it to secure our future and to quietly support the policyholder protection efforts. I had taken their money and used it to help repair some of the damage they caused. There is a particular kind of justice in that. If you believe the quiet, prepared person can change everything, type quiet power in the comments. I read every single one. The final act was approaching, and I was ready. The annual policyholder meeting at Harrington headquarters was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, it became the stage where everything ended. I wore a simple navy dress. Nothing flashy, just the clothes of a woman who worked with numbers. I sat near the back with Ruth beside me. The room was filled with gray-haired retirees, many clutching folders of their policy statements like lifelines. These were the real people behind the reserves. The ones Vivian had quietly risked. Vivian stood at the podium in her best armor, pearls, perfect posture, and that heavy lavender scent. She began with the usual corporate speak, thanking loyal clients, dismissing baseless rumors, promising a record year. She said the word strong 4 times. Strong companies never need to say it that often. Then the side door opened. 2 representatives from the state insurance department walked in. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The lead examiner introduced herself calmly and announced that, following a financial examination, the commissioner had placed Harrington Life and Legacy under immediate supervision. New business was suspended. The company would enter rehabilitation proceedings. A murmur swept through the crowd. Vivian froze at the podium. Then she broke. She gripped the sides of the lectern, her voice rising into something shrill and ugly. She pointed directly at me in the back of the room. "This is her doing," she shouted. "My former daughter-in-law. A spiteful, vindictive woman who—" Her hand shook so badly when she tried to grab her fountain pen that it only smeared a black streak across her notes. The same pen that had clicked so confidently in my hospital room could no longer write a single word. I stood up slowly and walked to the front. The room fell silent. Cameras from local news turned toward me. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. "I don't get loud," I said clearly so the entire room could hear. "I get accurate." I turned to the policyholders. "I'm an actuary. I was brought into this family and treated as temporary. When I refused to disappear, they tried to buy my children. When that didn't work, I did the only thing I know how to do. I read the numbers. And the numbers showed that this company had been making promises it could no longer keep. I looked directly at Vivian. "You called me a line item. You were right. So I read the entire ledger. The line that didn't balance was yours." The woman in the front row clutching her statements stood up with tears in her eyes and asked the only question that mattered. "Is our care safe?" I answered honestly, clearly, and with every bit of professional integrity I possessed. The state supervision wasn't the disaster. It was the rescue. The system existed precisely for moments like this. Vivian's empire, built on 40 years of careful lies, was finally meeting the truth. And the truth, as my father taught me, always wins in the end. The rest happened with the quiet inevitability of correct math. Harrington Life and Legacy moved from supervision into full rehabilitation. The state took control, the books were opened completely, and the manufactured strength evaporated overnight. The family's paper fortune, built on hollow reserves, collapsed. Hartwell House was sold. The once untouchable name became synonymous with regulatory failure in every industry publication. Marcus lost his license and faced professional consequences. Sloan stayed gone. Garrett's airtight legal strategies proved worthless against actual evidence. And I kept my children. I kept the settlement. And I took back my own name. We are the Voss family now, me, Sophie, Rowan, and Theo. I used part of the money to establish a small foundation that helps support policyholders in rehabilitation cases. I still consult on the Harrington rehabilitation from a distance, walled off from any conflict of interest. Every month, I sign checks that help ensure the widow who trusted that company still gets her care. Some evenings, when the triplets are sleeping, I sit on the porch and think about that hospital room. The click of the pen. The smell of lavender. The moment I chose to sign, not because I was surrendering, but because I was choosing my own battlefield. They thought they bought my silence. Instead, they funded my freedom. The dangerous person in that hospital bed was never the one with the money and the lawyers. It was the quiet one holding the babies. The one who understood that numbers, like children, were never theirs to buy. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever chosen truth over comfort, if you've ever protected what mattered most with nothing but patience and preparation, then you already know how this story ends. The calm ones don't just survive. We balance the scales. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this chapter. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength is still the most powerful force in the world. I'll see you in the next story.